The last culture we're going to discuss in Mesoamerica is the Aztec. And the Aztec are known for basically being named after Lake Aztlan, right? Lake Aztlan. But at the same time, their name for themselves was the Mexica. So if they would have been speaking about themselves, they would have called themselves the Mexica, which is where the name Mexico comes from. However, they were named by the Spanish, right? So they were named after Lake Aztlan, which was part of the region that they were living in. So notice how names can get interesting, right? Based on who is in power and who is naming you, right? You're looking here at the Mendoza Codex, which is a manuscript page, right? It's part of a book that depicted the area, right, that the Aztec were living in. So it's sort of a representation of the region, right, that they're living in. In the mythology, right, of the Aztec or the Mexica, as they called themselves, right, they were told to leave their homeland, right, and to travel until they saw a sign. So they're directed by one of their gods, right? You'll see his name, Huitzilopochtli. He'll come up again a little bit later when we talk about some other mythology. We call him Hummingbird on the left, but they're directed by their god to leave, right, and to journey until they see the sign. The sign is going to be an eagle on a prickly pear cactus. So if you're looking at the codex, you'll notice there's this eagle and it's standing on a prickly pear cactus. If you go look at the Mexican flag, right, you may notice more of this symbology, right? So again, Mexican, the name, the symbology on the flag, etc. It all comes from the Aztec background. From the codex, you'll notice that you have the sign or the symbol, right, that let them know that they were at their homeland. And from that, you'll notice that water spreads out through the blue, right, abstracted kind of lines. And then you'll notice that below that, you have the city of Tenochtitlan, which is their main city represented. And then these little people that look like, right, that little people wrapped up and they have on their cloaks like little names that say the other Aztec cities, right? So this is sort of a representation of the Aztec world as it was thought of, right? Hummingbird is the sun god, so when we talk about him later, right? Keep this in mind. He's considered one of the most important gods to the Aztec people, um, and really has a big part to play, right, in their mythology. But again, this sort of breaks down the background of the Aztec, right? The mythology related to their migration to the Tenochtitlan area, right? Seeing the sign of the eagle on the prickly pear cactus, right, in their beginnings. Tenochtitlan, right, was their main city, again, centered around Lake Aztlan. And you'll notice that if you're looking at this depiction of it, it kind of looks like Venice in a lot of ways, right? Because it was set literally on the banks of the lake and then in the lake itself. So the city was actually quite complex, right? As far as how you had to travel within it. You could travel by some of these bridges that you see kind of coming from the mainland off into the areas that are more in the lake. Of course, they use a lot of boats, right, to get around, right, within the city itself. And it was a really, really large city, about 200,000 people, so roughly a little bit smaller than Tallahassee to give you a sense of size. So a rather large, right, urban space. Unfortunately for us, Tenochtitlan is gone, right? Because modern Mexico City is built on top of it, right? And that is why a lot of the art pieces that we find when we're actually excavating to make improvements in Mexico City. Like they'll be putting in like some water main lines, right? Or they're putting in a new infrastructure for a new building, and they'll be digging down in, and they'll find art pieces like the piece you see here, the Stone of the Sun, that we'll talk about in a minute, right? But Mexico City actually exists on top of Tenochtitlan, essentially. So Tenochtitlan, you can't go there, right? You can't see it. And as we talked about with like, the city of Cusco, right, in Peru, the dominant culture coming in, right, often will build on top of the ruins of the previous culture to make a point, right, about who's in control, right, who's in power. The Aztec had a very specific position about art, and their position was that, like, all earthly things would be destroyed, but art would remain and transcend. So to them, art was like a work of the gods, right? It was something that was eternal, it was immortal. So they had a lot of value, right? They placed on the arts. Great for us, right? That they thought so much of the arts. Now, the Aztec are a fun culture to look at, especially through the role of blood, right? And the role of blood and within these people. And I can't stress enough that these are people who thought of bloodshed as something that was extremely necessary for their culture to exist and survive. It's one of the reasons why there'll be a lot of conflict, right, between the Europeans that are coming in and the Aztec, because their life ways will be so different, right, about sacrifice and how you use people, right, how you sort of use blood, right, within your culture. The stone of the sun that you see here on the left, you can see how it would have looked like when it was painted, right? Remember, a lot of these monuments, the way we see them today, is not the way that they were intended to be seen, right? They were meant to be very colorful pieces, right? So the stone of the sun is heavily would have been heavily painted and very beautiful. You notice in the middle you have the sun, and out of its mouth, you know, there's kind of like a tongue sticking out. That was really representing the idea of like a hand axe. Go back and look at the Kunstachs, right? This idea of something that would be used for cutting, right? And in its hands, you'll notice it's holding and squeezing something. It was holding these human hearts and kind of squeezing the blood out of it. So, what Aztec believed is that the sun needed blood to rise and set and go about its daily business, right? Without blood, the sun would not rise to the sky. It would not, you know, give you the sun that you needed to grow your crops, right? So this bloodshed thing was sort of linked to everything functional within their culture, that you needed the blood to survive. And their mythology is rather gory, right? It has a lot of gore just kind of built up into it. You can see this in the story of their god Coatlicue that you see depicted here. Coatlicue was Hummingbird on the left's mother, right, or Hitchcalaputli's mother. And there's a neat mythology that goes along with his birth, and we'll talk about that in a second. Coatlicue is called She of the Serpent Skirt. You'll know she's wearing kind of this skirt made up of snakes. Her head's also snakes. We'll get to that in a minute as well. And she's looked at as kind of like this dark goddess, right? A goddess of sacrifice, right? And I always say that there's this kind of Kali-esque overtones, right, of the dark mother, right, or the dark feminine, right? You know that you see that, right, in talking about her mythology, because she's the inevitability of death, but she's actually born out of birth. Because in the story, right, of Hummingbird's birth or Hitchlalaputli's birth, Coatlicue is said to be mysteriously with child, and that her daughter demands to know where her pregnancy comes from. And when Coatlicue refuses to tell her, right, she sends her 400 brothers to kill her. Okay, so if you know your comparative religious thinking, right, you know, in Christianity, we have a mysterious birth, right? A mysteriously with child woman. So notice in a lot of mythology, this is a similar story that comes up. It's not unique to Christianity in any way, shape, or form. You have Isis, of course, in Egyptian mythology. Um, so just a note on that there. But in the story, you know, her daughter's like, no, this will not stand. You know, you have to tell me why you're pregnant, right? You know, and the mother's just like, nope. And so the brothers come to attack and kill Coatlicue, kill the mother, and Hummingbird from in her womb whispers like, mother, it will be all right, right? And basically emerges from her womb battle ready. Here he is in the imagery that you're seeing, right? Battle ready. He wears his crown of feathers right on his head. He's Hummingbird on the left after all, right? And avenges his mother, kills his brothers, right? And forces his sister to pay. During the conflict, though, unfortunately, Coatlicue is beheaded, and serpents spring from her head, and that's why I would say she's transformed into a death deity, after she creates life, in a sense. So if you know anything about Osiris, right, in Egyptian mythology, this idea that his brother kills him and dismembers him, but Isis, his wife and sister, puts him back together, and he becomes the god of the dead. So again, if you know your religious mythology, this is not like a singular story, right? You see stories like this throughout other mythologies as well. But this is how she becomes sort of the dark goddess, we might say. The sister, right, of course, is punished. Uh, she is cut up, right, and thrown down the steps of the temple. Here you see her body parts kind of being held together by snakes, right, in this image. Notice the use of profiles still in a lot of this imagery, right? They were using these stones, and they often would use profiles, very similar to South America, if you remember the kind of way it's constructed. But the sister basically is humiliated, right? You'll notice that nudity was actually even used as a public humiliation in this culture, right? So she's nude, she's dismembered, and it's said that she actually has to become the moon goddess because she has to hide from her brother, who's the sun god, right? So that they can never be at the same space at the same time. So the sun is hummingbird, right? And the moon is Koilashwashki. So the moon goddess becomes the sister, and the brother and the sister never see each other again. So the art that supports this mythology, you'll notice, is really fabulous and really interesting. And again, also shows you the role of blood, right, in this culture. Now, what is the role of human sacrifice? And by the way, these are much more contemporary images that you're seeing. I just think they help support, what we're talking about here. These are not from the Aztec time period, the image you're seeing here. The sun depended on human sacrifice, right? They believed very strongly that the sun needed human sacrifice to exist, right? To keep rising. And they had very elaborate ceremonies revolving around this. Like one ceremony you'll see, had a priest starting a fire in a heart cavity, which, is pretty damn hard considering it's all bloody and, wet, right? But this is, again, I would say killing on an industrial scale. This is an image from the end of the Aztec Empire. We think this actually was made by Spanish artists, where you'll notice that you can see the sun looking down on the sacrifice, right? The body, the heart being ripped out of the body and offered up to the sun, who looks down, and then this sort of idea of a pyramid down below, right? Um, Again, the Aztecs really believed in blood sacrifice on an industrial scale. There's talks of how they would be bringing hundreds of Aztecs up these pyramids and sacrificing them and over and over and over again, right? However, Aztecs really also thought about these sacrifices as being sacred or consecrated, almost similar to the idea of Mana in the Pacific. And it was a point of contention between Christians and Aztec, this blood sacrifice. And the Aztec were confused by the Christians being so upset about it because they said, well, why are you upset about us eating our sacrifices, right? These are holy sacrifices to the gods. They didn't really understand, it wasn't cannibalism to them, it was eating power, right? And they said, well, you eat your God, like you eat the body of Christ through, communion. So what are you complaining about? So the Aztec were often very confused about why the Christians could eat their God, literally, right? But there was such a hubbub about them eating these people. And so this idea of a holy meal, right, or relating this idea to communion starts to sort of pop up in the Aztec culture right towards the end as the Christians are taking over. And again, it's an interesting sort of connection between the two religiosities, might we say. But I always say this is why the Spanish won. The Aztec didn't believe in killing people outright. They wanted to use the blood, right? Spanish just believed in killing people. They wanted to gain control, right? So they, in a sense, they used that as an advantage, right, over the people of Tenochtitlan. And, again, colonialism has a huge impact here. Cortez arriving around 1520, and most of the people being decimated either through warfare or pox. And as I mentioned before, Mexico City is built on the ruins, right, of Tenochtitlan. What is the lasting impact of colonialism here? It's an interesting mix of what the colonialists brought in and the surviving indigenous culture kind of being mixed together. So if you go somewhere like San Javier del Bac in Tucson, where I did my master's degree, you can see these Christian churches, but again with this flair, right, of sort of Mexican embellishment, right? That the imagery looks very Mexican, looks very Mesoamerican in this kind of way. And I always say you have to consider how people take what is given to them and then sort of interpret it, right, through their regionality, right, or through their ethnicity. So if you look at this image of Christ from Guatemala, notice he looks like a Guatemalan. Why would he not, right? Um, and when I was traveling in Guatemala, we were actually there doing during the Saint Day of Saint Anthony or San Antonio, right, in Spanish. And it was fascinating to watch the religious fervor, right, of the community of San Antonio in Guatemala, right, really have this theatrical display, right, of the feast day, right, and how to interact with the feast day. It becomes pageantry, it becomes theatrical. But at the same time, I always say that even though you see a lot of heavy, heavy Christianity here in Mesoamerica, you still see a lot of connection to the gods of the indigenous religions. So when I was in Guatemala, we also went and saw some people holding vigil for the god Maximon. And this is an old indigenous god related to, all the tribal religions before Christianity arrived in this region. And we were speaking to some of the people about, like, well, if you're Christian, isn't this sort of against your beliefs? And they were like, no, we can honor the old gods and the new. And again, I don't really think that's what Christianity intended, but you'll notice in a lot of places that are colonized, this is their position on it. They see no reason why they shouldn't keep their old gods and be good Christians at the same time. They don't see like a disjunctiveness with there, or they don't see a problem there. They're just like, well, no, there's no problem. Moximon was like a trickster god, by the way. So the people that hang out with him and sort of spend the vigil with him, they drink whiskey with him and then pour him little whiskeys, right, or little tequilas. They'll smoke cigars with him. You'll notice a cigar in his mouth. So he's kind of a god of debauchery and trickery. And so again, a contrast or a foil to this idea of like Christ and forgiveness and sacrifice, this little trickster god. But you'll notice that to me, a lot of colonialism is about the absorption of colonial practice, right, or Christianized European practice, while still keeping indigenous things kind of in the background operating as well. So it's an interesting mix of the old and the new.